Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Gene Wilder is answering an easy question about his latest film, when Richard Pryor, sitting beside him on the Tonight Show couch, suddenly reaches over and grips Gene's wrist so tightly that Gene stops mid-sentence. Richard's hand is shaking, and what Richard Pryor says next, in front of 20 million Americans, is something Gene Wilder has been waiting 9 years to hear. But before we dive in, quick reminder, double-check that you're subscribed, since a lot of you think you already are and aren't. It's free, and it really helps the channel. Thank you for being here. The Tonight Show was recorded that afternoon, in the fall of 1989, before a studio audience of roughly 300 people at NBC's Burbank studios. The broadcast set to air to nearly 19 million Americans later that night. Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor had come on together to promote their third film as a pairing, and for the first several minutes, the conversation moved exactly the way anyone who had watched their on-screen chemistry over the previous decade might have expected. Easy, warm, punctuated by the kind of laughter that only comes from two people who trust each other completely. Johnny Carson leaned back, clearly enjoying himself, letting the two actors carry the segment the way he always did when the energy between guests needed no management at all. "Gene," Johnny said, "how did you two end up working together in the first place? I hear it almost didn't happen." Gene Wilder smiled, glancing at Richard before answering. "That's true," Gene said. "Richard was supposed to do Silver Streak with someone else entirely, and I was terrified of him before I ever met him, if I'm being honest. I'd seen his stand-up. I thought, this man is going to eat me alive on that soundstage." Richard laughed, the easy, booming laugh audiences had come to associate with him as much as any of his comedy. "And you were right to be scared," Richard said, grinning. "For about a day. Then Gene did something in a scene that made me forget I was supposed to be intimidating anybody, and I thought, oh no, I actually like this guy. Wait, do not miss this detail, because as the audience laughed along with the exchange, something shifted in Richard Pryor's posture, a stillness settling into him that had not been there a moment before. His hand, resting on the arm of the couch, moved almost involuntarily toward Gene's wrist, and when he gripped it, the grip was tight enough that Gene's easy expression faltered mid-sentence. "Richard," Gene said, glancing down at the hand on his wrist, then back up at his friend's face. "You all right?" Richard Pryor did not answer right away. His eyes, usually so quick and expressive, had gone distant, focused on something beyond the studio lights, beyond the cameras, beyond even Gene himself. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next, because the story that was about to unfold reached back 9 years, to a hospital room in Los Angeles, and a night in 1980 that neither man had ever discussed publicly, a night that had almost ended everything before their partnership had truly begun. June of 1980. Richard Pryor had suffered severe burns over more than half his body in what was reported publicly at the time as a tragic accident involving rum and a lit cigarette, though the fuller, more complicated truth of that night would take Richard years to speak about openly in any format, including years later in his own autobiography. He spent 6 weeks in the burn unit at Sherman Oaks Community Hospital, enduring a level of physical pain that he would later describe as reshaping something fundamental in how he understood his own mortality. Visitors were limited. The burn unit staff maintained strict protocols, understanding that infection posed as great a threat to Richard's recovery as the injuries themselves. Gene Wilder, who had worked alongside Richard on only one film at that point, Silver Streak, 3 years earlier, was not family. He had no obvious claim to visitation rights beyond friendship, and a fairly new friendship at that, built across a handful of months on a single film set rather than years of accumulated history. But Jean called the hospital every single day for 6 weeks, not to speak to Richard, whose condition made phone conversations impossible for much of that period, but simply to ask the nursing staff how he was doing, to leave brief messages of encouragement that the nurses would read aloud during dressing changes. Moments, Richard later said, were some of the only times during that period he remembered feeling like a person rather than a patient. On the 11th day, hospital staff made an exception to their usual visitor restrictions, allowing Jean Wilder into the burn unit for exactly 15 minutes, fully gowned, masked, and gloved against infection risk. Richard was barely conscious for most of that visit, drifting in and out under heavy medication, his face and upper body wrapped in bandages that left almost nothing of his familiar features visible. Jean sat beside the bed and talked quietly, about nothing important, the way people do when they are trying to fill a silence that feels too large and too frightening to simply sit inside. He talked about a script he was reading. He talked about the weather in Los Angeles that week. He talked about absolutely nothing that mattered, filling those 15 minutes with the ordinary texture of life, because he understood, somehow, that ordinary things were exactly what Richard needed to hear in a room otherwise dominated by machines and pain. The head nurse on that ward, a woman named Carol Jennings, who would later speak about the visit only after Richard himself gave her permission, said that most visitors who came through that unit during those weeks fell into one of two categories, either overwhelmed into silence by what they saw, or overcompensating with a forced cheerfulness that patients could see through immediately. Jean Wilder, she said, was neither. He simply talked to Richard the way he would have talked to him on any ordinary day before the accident. No different tone, no careful avoidance of certain words, no performance of optimism. She said it was the most natural 15 minutes she witnessed in that unit across her entire career there, and that she found herself, against her own professional instinct to remain detached, standing just outside the curtain longer than necessary simply to keep listening. Near the end of the visit, in one of the brief windows when Richard surfaced closer to full consciousness, he reportedly whispered something to Jean that the nursing staff on duty that day would remember clearly for years afterward, one of them eventually sharing the story, with Richard's later permission, in a magazine profile. Richard had asked, his voice barely audible through cracked lips, whether Jean thought he would ever work again, whether anyone would ever want to look at him again once the bandages came off. Jean Wilder, without any hesitation the nurse could detect, told him that he would not only work again, but that Jean intended to make sure of it personally, that he was already thinking about what film they would make together next, and that Richard Pryor's face, whatever it looked like when the bandages finally came off, was never what had made him brilliant in the first place. What Jean did not tell Richard that day, what he would not reveal until 9 years later on that Tonight Show stage, was that he had gone directly from the hospital parking lot to a payphone outside and called his agent, instructing him to begin developing a project specifically built around the two of them, not because it made obvious commercial sense in that uncertain moment, but because Jean had decided, sitting in that hospital room, that Richard Pryor needed something to walk toward once he was ready to walk anywhere at all. Back in the Burbank studio, Richard Pryor's grip on Jean's wrist loosened slightly, though he did not let go entirely. "I never told you this," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying an unsteadiness that had nothing to do with the tremor that had become a familiar part of his public appearances by 1989. That day in the hospital. I don't remember most of it. The drugs, the pain, it's mostly a blur even now. But I remember you were there. I remember a voice that wasn't scared of me, when everybody else looking at me back then was scared, even the ones who loved me." The audience had gone completely silent, 300 people sitting in the particular hush that settles over a room when something true and unrehearsed begins to unfold in front of them. Ed McMahon, who had been chuckling along with the earlier banter, slowly set down whatever he had been holding. Johnny Carson leaned forward at his desk, his usual easy authority replaced by careful, attentive stillness. Gene Wilder's eyes had filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. "I called that hospital every day for 6 weeks," Gene said, his voice breaking. "I didn't tell you that either. I didn't want you to feel like you owed anybody anything for it. I just needed to know you were still there." Richard Pryor's own eyes were wet now, the tremor in his hand becoming more pronounced as he tightened his grip once more on Gene's wrist. "You told the nurse I'd work again," Richard said. "She told me that, years later, after I was well enough to hear it without falling apart. She said you told her you were already planning our next movie before I could even see straight." Gene nodded slowly. "Stir-crazy," Gene said. "I started talking to my agent about it before you were even out of the burn unit. I don't know if I really believed we'd make it happen that fast. I just knew I needed you to have something to walk toward." Richard Pryor's composure, famous for its unpredictability, famous for swinging without warning, between devastating honesty and explosive humor, gave way completely. He pulled Gene into an embrace right there on the couch, the microphones on both men catching the sound of Richard's breathing, unsteady and raw, as he held on. "Thank you," Richard said, the words muffled against Gene's shoulder, "for not being scared of me, for thinking I still had something worth waiting for." Gene Wilder, holding his friend, could not speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper, though the studio microphones carried it clearly to every person watching. "You never had anything to thank me for," Gene said. "You gave me 9 years of the best work of my life, and every single day of it, I got to watch you prove that nurse's promise true, over and over again, one movie at a time." The studio held its breath. Nobody applauded right away, because what had happened was too large, too tender for the usual sounds a television audience makes. Johnny Carson, visibly moved, waited a long moment before speaking, giving the two men the space the moment demanded, rather than rushing to fill it the way lesser hosts might have. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny finally said, quietly, "that's what 9 years of real friendship looks like. And I don't think any of us just watching television tonight were lucky enough to witness that very often. If a story like this moves you even a little, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I want to ask you something specific. Think of someone who believed in you when you had every reason to doubt yourself. Someone whose belief carried you somewhere you couldn't have gotten to alone. And drop just their first name in the comments below, so we can see how many of us are carrying that kind of gratitude around with us." The Tonight Show ran 7 minutes over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard stayed lit well past midnight, calls coming in from burn survivors, from their families, from people who had spent their own recoveries wondering whether anyone would still see them the same way once the visible signs of what they'd survived became permanent. Letters arrived at NBC for weeks afterward, several of them from burn unit nurses across the country who said the broadcast had become something they shared with new patients, a small piece of evidence that recovery, however uncertain it looked in the moment, could still lead somewhere worth walking toward. Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor made one more film together after that broadcast, and in every interview either man gave about their partnership for the remainder of their careers, both consistently pointed to that hospital visit, once they had finally spoken about it publicly, as the true foundation of everything that followed. More important, they each said separately, than any scene they ever shot together. Richard Pryor's daughter later recalled that after the broadcast aired, her father called Gene almost every week for years afterward, often for no particular reason at all, conversations that could run 5 minutes or an hour depending on the day. A habit, she said, had clearly started with those 6 weeks of daily hospital calls and simply never stopped, as though some part of both men understood that the phone ringing regularly was itself a kind of promise being kept. When Richard Pryor passed away in December of 2005, Gene Wilder released a short statement that included a single line that friends of both men said captured the entire relationship more completely than any tribute twice its length could have managed. He wrote, "I told a nurse once that his face was never what made him brilliant, and I spent 25 years watching him prove me right." Gene Wilder passed away 9 years later, in 2016, and among the personal effects his family found afterward was a small spiral notebook from 1980, its pages yellowed with age, containing scattered notes for a film project labeled simply, "For Richard, when he's ready." Dated 11 days after a phone call from a payphone outside a Los Angeles hospital, 9 years before either man ever spoke of that day in front of a single camera. If this story moved you, think about the people who believed in you before you believed in yourself, the ones who quietly started planning your comeback before you even knew you needed one. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And before you go, hit that like button if this one got you. It really does help. Then drop a comment and tell me, has someone ever believed in you before you were ready to believe in yourself? Just tell us what happened. Let's remember them here together.